The last few years, it seemed as though this word sustainability was coming up increasingly, perhaps because of the recession and people being worried that they weren't going to be able to sustain their operations. But also you started to hear, these words like ecosystem and ecology, and that we needed to be paying attention to the ecosystem and the arts ecology. And I started asking myself what we really meant by that. And at the same time, there was also this sort of interesting supply-demand conversation that happened at one point, really spurred by a comment that Rocco Landesman had made at a convening, and questions about, if we have an overbuilt infrastructure, is it okay to suggest that maybe there are too many organizations, and people coming back and saying, look, there's no such thing as too much art, so move off of this. So, these were the questions that were in my mind. One of the first things I did, because I'm not a sustainability expert, is I went and looked up the roots of the word, and it comes from the Latin sustenere. Sus is up, tenere is to hold, so to hold up. And it struck me that there are two sort of meanings to that, right? We think of upholding as in upholding the arts, upholding what we believe in, promoting those values, promoting and perpetuating the values of the arts, but then also to hold up in the sense of, you can block something. And so really this talk is at the heart of it asking the question, as we are trying to hold up our sector, sustain it, are we in fact keeping it from, preventing it from having intellectual and social relevance, because we are in fact preventing the necessary adaptations that need to occur for the arts to, maintain their relevancy. Then I came across this definition by Jane Jacobs, and it was very similar at first, sort of sustainability suggests that there's reliable resource, but she goes into it a little bit further and says there's a suggestion that you're not going to spend resources at a rate any speedier or greedier than they can naturally renew themselves. And she says it implies an environmental morality. And when I first read that definition in her book, The Nature of Economies, I thought, okay, this actually puts a twist on it, because the suggestion is that an organization or an entire sector, potentially, could accumulate the political power, economic power, social power, to be able to draw significant resources to it, but that it perhaps has a moral obligation to not spend more than its fair share for the good of the whole. And, I did some sleuthing around into the National Center for Charitable Statistics database, and began to see statistics like 1% of 1/2% of dance companies capture 60% of the revenues for the sector, etc. And this winner-take-all idea really was something that I started to look at and think, do we need to in fact begin to ask the question, are we sustaining some institutions at the expense of the sector as a whole? Are we demanding so much from artists, from staff members, from board members, from our communities? The ticket prices keep going up. We demand more and more contributions. And to some degree, are we eroding the goodwill in trying to pull enough resource in to keep everything going? And then I came across this third definition that by a scholar named Lexie Boyanov from the Institute for Ecological Economics, and he talks about the paradoxes of sustainability, and there are two basically. And the first thing he says is that he did a lot of research, looked into various definitions of sustainability, and that by and large what most papers had in common, most research had in common, there was always this sense of trying to keep something at a certain level, a resource, a relationship, a system, trying to avoid decline. And he says, the issue there is that most living systems, and we know this is the case also with organizations, go through life cycles. And so there is growth followed by, there's sort of emergence followed by growth, and then a plateauing or sustaining, and then decline, and following decline you sort of get new growth. And he says, so sustainability seems to be an attempt to break that natural cycle and to keep something in a natural, sort of the growth phase or the plateau phase for longer than is natural. And so he says, so the first paradox of sustainability is actually to live, you have to allow for death. And that's a difficult concept for people who want to just keep organizations alive. The second paradox that he talks about has to do with the fact that there are multiple systems, hierarchies of systems. And so he says, you need to be careful about which level in the system you're trying to sustain. Because trying to sustain one level, you may be damaging, in fact, a higher level. And the easiest way to think about this, I think, is sort of like the forest fire analogy, which people often know, which is that forest fires naturally occur and burn down parts of the forest, and that keeps the entire forest ecosystem alive and healthy. If we went in and suddenly tried to prevent forest fires and keep parts of the forest living, we would, in fact, over time, damage the entire forest ecosystem, and everything would die, right? So out of this, I really try to ask the question, what perhaps are we trying to sustain that might otherwise be dying, need to die even, and what part of the system are we trying to sustain and why? And what I suspect is that, you know, foundations, donors, leaders of arts organizations, etc., that we have this built-in logic that says to us that we must sustain the largest and oldest institutions and then sort of work our way down from there, but that it is the organizations themselves that need to be sustained. And that's really what the conversation has been about the last few years. How are we going to sustain all of this infrastructure? And the question I would put forward is, are we conflating sustaining organizations with sustaining the matteringness of the arts, the relevance of the arts, and are those two different things? And if the higher system that we're trying to aim for is sustaining the relevance, the intellectual and social relevance, the matteringness of the arts, we might need to allow these organizations actually to die, if not physically, spiritually, you know, philosophically. We might need to allow for a transformation in their purpose, in their programming, in the way that they're oriented to society, and in order to make them more relevant. Well, what's the risk of trying to sustain all of this? And what it seems to me that as we try to prop up institutions that may not be actually sustainable in their current form and shape and organization, is that it seems we drive them in one of three directions. One is toward the market, right? We turn towards sort of short-term measures of success, box office, economic impact, etc. The other, I think, is sort of a turn towards the wealthy. We begin to orient our institutions towards upper middle class and increasingly sort of lose touch with the rest of the community. And I think the third shift is really toward mediocrity, where we simply, in a way, abandon our purpose and goals that we were set out to achieve, and just kind of keep ourselves cranking along in a sort of, you know, Walking Dead state, what Brian Newman in the book 20 Under 40 calls, you know, these zombies, art zombies. So that, I think, is the risk, right? That it's not as though by sustaining this infrastructure we're keeping alive our goals and our purpose. We're actually turning into something else that's not as powerful, not as meaningful to society, and therefore eroding, in a way, our very purpose. Do we need to ask ourselves some questions, if we're all looking at ourselves, you know, the boards of directors and leaders of organizations, if we think that our role in life, our role is to sort of look out for the interests of our institution, who's looking out for the community at large, right? Who's asking the question, are we trying to sustain one organization at the expense of many others? Or are we trying to sustain perhaps the arts and culture sector at the expense of other social services? Or are we trying to sustain dance companies, opera companies, theater companies at the expense of artists, creativity, culture, engagement? And so those are questions that I think we really all have to hold ourselves accountable to asking. And I would suggest that these leaders are working for a purpose that transcends their individual institutions, right? That we should be joining forces and working for the relevance of the arts, the matteringness of the arts, and really get above this idea that our purpose in life is just to keep individual organizations going.